Every man who's ever sat in the Oval Office knew one thing the rest of us only feel in nightmares, that the job comes with a loaded target on your back. This isn't a conspiracy video. It's not about grassy knolls or shadowy cabals. It's about facts, real men, real guns, real attempts to erase a president from history in the blink of a muzzle flash. From flintlocks that misfired in Jackson's face to modern-day rifle shots aimed at Trump, this is a bullet-riddled timeline of every moment someone tried to kill a president of the United States. Some died. Some lived. All were changed. Because in America, power doesn't just come with enemies, it comes with snipers. This is every U.S. president assassination attempt. And it's a miracle this list isn't longer. Andrew Jackson. On January 30, 1835, the air outside the United States Capitol was thick with the kind of fog that doesn't just cling to your coated sticks in your bones. It was the kind of day you could disappear into if you wanted to kill a man and vanish before the smoke cleared. Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, didn't vanish. He was leaving the funeral of a congressman, of all things, dressed in black, walking with the slow, deliberate gait of a man whose bones had long since declared mutiny. At 67, Jackson was older, thinner, and meaner than he'd ever been. He had survived smallpox, dysentery, countless duels, and a bullet lodged permanently in his chest from a past confrontation. Death, for Jackson, was a familiar house guest. He just hadn't invited him for lunch that day. Enter Richard Lawrence, a 35-year-old English-born house painter with a waxy face and a brain bubbling over with delusions. He believed he was King Richard III, deserved vast wealth, and that Jackson was keeping him from his rightful riches by refusing to recharter the Second Bank of the United States. That last part at least was technically true. Jackson had famously hated the National Bank. The rest? Pure hallucinatory ambition. Lawrence had stalked Jackson for weeks, trailing him through the muddy Washington streets, rehearsing the moment in his mind. He'd even attended church services where Jackson prayed, watching the president bow his head while Lawrence's fingers twitched with anticipation. In his boarding house room, he practiced drawing his pistols before a spotted mirror, whispering "death to tyrants" with each fluid motion. As Jackson stepped into the open air, Lawrence emerged from the crowd. He raised a pistol flintlock, single shot, .50 caliber. The kind of weapon that could tear through a man's torso like a cannonball through wet parchment. He aimed it at Jackson's chest. He pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing. Just a puff of smoke. The percussion cap ignited, but the powder failed to catch. The ball never left the barrel. Jackson flinched, looked down, then up, and locked eyes with Lawrence. That's when Lawrence pulled a second pistol from beneath his coat. Same make, same target. He fired. Click. Another misfire. The odds of 2 flintlocks failing back-to-back were astronomical. Some later claimed it was divine intervention. Others, that the high humidity had dampened the powder. In truth, it didn't matter. Jackson didn't wait for a third try. He surged forward like a wounded bear. With a feral roar and his signature hickory cane, Jackson launched into an attack, beating Lawrence with a force that stunned witnesses. His face twisted into something primal, something older than democracy itself, the raw fury of a frontier duelist who'd been cheated of a proper fight. "By the Eternal," he bellowed, each blow of his cane punctuating his rage. The crowd froze, caught between horror and fascination as America's president transformed into America's most dangerous man. He had to be physically restrained by nearby aides, and a young congressman, ironically, future President James Buchanan, from turning Lawrence into a public smear on the cobblestones. Even as they pulled him back, Jackson's eyes never left Lawrence's face. It was as if he wanted to memorize the features of a man who had dared to rob him of his dignity. Lawrence was tackled, disarmed, and arrested. He would never face a jury. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity and spent the rest of his life in an asylum, where he raved about being royalty and never once accepted that his pistols had failed him. On hot summer nights, attendants would hear him recreating the assassination, both triggers clicking harmlessly in the darkness of his cell. But the true shock wasn't Lawrence's madness. It was Jackson's reaction. He wasn't scared. He was furious. The idea that someone would dare interrupt the theater of his life with such amateur-hour villainy was almost insulting. In Jackson's mind, it wasn't an assassination attempt, it was bad manners. Later that night, as Jackson's physician checked him for injuries, the president sat stone-faced, sipping whiskey that burned less than his indignation. "I have had more threats upon my life than hairs on my head," he muttered, "and this is how the devil chooses to collect? With a malfunctioning pistol and a lunatic?" His doctor later wrote that he'd never seen a man so insulted by someone trying to kill him. And yet, as absurd and miraculous as the moment was, it wouldn't be the last time someone brought a gun to the American presidency. It was merely the opening act in a macabre tradition that would haunt the office for centuries to come. Jackson walked away from the Capitol that day, blood boiling, lungs full of rage, and a cane still warm in his fist. Behind him, the crowd buzzed, half in disbelief, half in awe. The man was bulletproof, at least for now. But 30 years later, the magic would run out. The next time a president was targeted, the gun would fire, the bullet would hit, and the world would change. Because Abraham Lincoln was not made of hickory. He was made of paper, fire, and a deadline. Abraham Lincoln. Long before the theater curtains ever rose on April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln had already survived more assassination attempts than most presidents dared to imagine. He wasn't just a tall target. He was a walking symbol of a nation tearing itself in half. And symbols attract bullets. It began before he even took office. In early 1861, President-elect Lincoln was on a whistle-stop tour, traveling from Illinois to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration. It was meant to be celebratory, unifying the tall rail splitter making his way east to take the helm of a divided republic. Crowds cheered, bands played, but not everyone in the shadows was applauding. Somewhere beneath the noise, a plot had begun to take shape. It would later be called the Baltimore Plot, and if it had succeeded, Lincoln would never have even reached the White House. Baltimore was a powder keg. Pro-slavery sympathies ran deep, and the city was swarming with Confederate sentiment. Local detectives, and eventually the famed private investigator Allan Pinkerton, picked up whispers of a conspiracy, that Lincoln would be attacked as he changed trains at the Calvert Street station. The plan, according to Pinkerton, involved multiple attackers. They would create a diversion and stab the president-elect during the transfer. The conspirators weren't just faceless shadows. They were prominent figures in Baltimore society, men who drank fine whiskey while plotting treason in wood-paneled rooms. They spoke of Lincoln as the guerrilla, the rail splitter, the black Republican who would destroy their way of life. They sharpened their knives and rehearsed the moment when history would bend to their will. Pinkerton convinced Lincoln to alter his route, even disguising him in a low-brimmed cap and a long overcoat. Lincoln, 6'4" and famously awkward, made for a terrible undercover agent. But under the cover of darkness and the cloak of anonymity, he slipped through Baltimore and into Washington, avoiding what could have been his first date with death. The newspapers mocked him for his caution. Cartoonists drew him sneaking into the Capitol like a coward. But Lincoln, with a wisdom that would define his presidency, knew when to fight and when to sidestep. "I would willingly take my chances," he told Pinkerton, "but I have no right to risk the safety of the country." He would not be so lucky the next time. Fast forward to August 1000, 864. The Civil War raged on. The White House lawn was still open to the public. People walked up to it like it was just another house on the block. And Lincoln, a creature of habit, often rode alone on horseback to the soldiers' home, a summer cottage just outside the city. One evening, as he was riding back, a gunshot cracked through the dusk. His horse bolted. Lincoln, stunned, returned to the White House and mentioned that the bullet had passed through the top of my hat. No bodyguards, no press release. Just Lincoln, quietly shaken, with a bullet hole where his stovepipe used to be. Private John Nichols, a sentinel at the soldiers' home, found the president's hat the next morning. A clean hole punctured the crown, exactly where Lincoln's head would have been if he hadn't moved at precisely the right moment. Lincoln told him to keep quiet about it. It might alarm the public, he said, as if his life were merely a footnote in the greater struggle. The war had already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. What was one more hat? But the third time, the shooter would not miss. April 14, 1865. Good Friday. The war was over. Lee had surrendered 5 days earlier at Appomattox. The nation was beginning to breathe again, the worst seemingly behind it. Lincoln, ever the dramatist, decided to attend a play, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater. He arrived with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, along with Major Henry Rathbone and Rathbone's fiancée. The presidential box was draped in flags. The scene was set. That morning, Lincoln had woken from a dream in which he wandered the White House, hearing sobs. He found a corpse in the East Room, wrapped in funeral vestments. "Who is dead in the White House?" he asked in the dream. "The president," came the reply. "He was killed by an assassin." Lincoln had laughed it off at breakfast. Dreams were just dreams, after all. Enter John Wilkes Booth, actor, Southern sympathizer, fanatical believer in the Confederacy. He wasn't just famous. He was charming. Booth knew the play, knew the theater, and knew exactly when the crowd would laugh loudest, a perfect cover for a gunshot. Booth had spent months plotting, gathering conspirators like collector's items. Their original plan had been more ambitious: to kidnap Lincoln and use him as leverage to restart the war. But surrender had changed everything. Now Booth wanted blood, not bargaining chips. At 10:15 p.m., he slipped into the box, raised a Derringer pistol, fired once, behind the left ear. Lincoln slumped forward. Rathbone lunged. Booth slashed him with a dagger and leapt from the balcony, breaking his leg in the fall but landing like a mad prophet on the stage. He shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus, always to tyrants, and fled into the chaos. The crowd gasped. The play was over. Mary Todd Lincoln's scream cut through the theater like a blade. "They have killed the president," someone shouted. The audience froze, caught between disbelief and horror. This wasn't in the script. Lincoln was carried across the street to the Peterson house, barely breathing. Doctors came, probed the wound, shook their heads. His pulse faded through the night like a distant drummer marching away. At 7:22 the next morning, Lincoln exhaled for the last time. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing at the bedside, whispered, "Now he belongs to the ages." His body, now a martyr's, began a journey by train back to Illinois, a funereal mirror of the journey he had taken 4 years earlier. 7 million Americans viewed the body as it traveled through cities and towns, the nation's grief measured in miles of black crepe and oceans of tears. The Baltimore plot had failed. The bullet that missed his hat had failed. But Booth had succeeded. Lincoln became the first president in U.S. history to be assassinated. And the nation, still bloody from civil war, realized that the office of the presidency had become not just a seat of power, but a target with a rotating bullseye. But the death of Lincoln didn't kill the idea of presidential assassination, it fertilized it. Just 2 decades later, another president would step into a train station and never walk out. James A. Garfield. It was a sweltering July morning in 1881, the kind that made Washington, D.C. feel more like a swamp than a capital. The marble buildings shimmered in the haze, horses snorted through the muck, and the 20th President of the United States, James Abram Garfield, was late for a train. He was headed to the coast for summer vacation with his family. A quiet escape after a noisy political year, Garfield had just survived one of the most chaotic elections in American history. He hadn't even wanted the job. He showed up to the 1,880 Republican National Convention as a compromise candidate, someone with clean hands and a calm mind, and left as the nominee. Now, months into his presidency, he was exhausted, ambushed from all sides by party infighting and patronage requests. The morning had begun with optimism. Garfield had awakened early, embraced his wife Lucretia, who was recovering from malaria at their summer cottage in Long Branch, New Jersey. "I wonder how you are feeling this morning," he had written in his diary. "I think of you all the time." He was a man who still believed in tenderness amid the cutthroat world of politics, perhaps his first mistake. He stepped into the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad station at 6th Street and Constitution Avenue, accompanied by his 2 sons, his Secretary of State James Blaine, and a handful of aides. The building was cavernous, its floors checkered in black and white tile, sunlight streaking through arched windows. The train wasn't set to leave for another 20 minutes. Garfield never made it to the platform. Lurking in the shadows of the station was Charles J. Guiteau, a 39-year-old drifter and failed everything. Failed lawyer, failed preacher, failed author. Guiteau was a man with delusions of grandeur and a deeply fractured mind. He believed God had chosen him to save the Republic and that Garfield was standing in the way. For weeks, Guiteau had been stalking the president's movements. He'd followed him to church, trailed him through the streets of Washington, even walked past the White House gates while rehearsing his plan. He'd written a speech titled Garfield versus Hancock, which he believed had secured Garfield's narrow victory. The speech had barely been distributed, but in Guiteau's mind, it had changed the course of American politics. Specifically, Guiteau was obsessed with not getting a political appointment. He had written letters to the White House, insisting he be named ambassador to France. When that failed, he began to stew. Then the voices in his head got louder. He bought a pistol, a fancy one, with an ivory handle, because he thought it would look good in a museum after he became famous. He tested it on the banks of the Potomac, making sure the sound wouldn't startle him when the moment came. He even borrowed money to hire a carriage to take him to jail after the deed was done, wanting to avoid the indignity of walking. As Garfield walked through the station's waiting room, Guiteau stepped forward. He pulled the revolver from his coat and fired once, hitting the president in the back. Garfield staggered. A second shot hit him again, this time near the spine. He collapsed. "My God, what is this?" Garfield cried out, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. Blood began to pool beneath him, a crimson stain spreading across the black and white tiles like a macabre chess opening. Panic erupted. Blaine turned, aghast. Guiteau stood there, calmly, and said, "I am a stalwart. Arthur is president now." He referred to Vice President Chester A. Arthur, the man he believed would reward him for what he had done. Guiteau was arrested on the spot. As police dragged him away, he showed no remorse. Instead, he seemed almost pleased, like a child who had finally gotten the attention he craved. "I did it," he announced proudly to anyone who would listen. "I will go to jail for it. They will punish me for it. I want Arthur for president, and I have got him." Garfield, however, wasn't dead. Not yet. Doctors swarmed. They did what doctors in 1881 did best: probed the wound with unwashed hands, unsterilized tools, and blind optimism. The bullet had lodged somewhere deep inside, but no one could find it. Alexander Graham Bell, yes, that Bell even tried to use a metal detector of his own invention to locate the slug. But the attempt failed due to interference from the metal bed springs beneath Garfield's body. A dozen different physicians inserted their fingers into the wound, each introducing new bacteria. They prescribed brandy, morphine, and quinine. They argued over treatments while newspapers printed hourly updates on the president's pulse, temperature, and diet. The nation hung on every bulletin, watching a slow-motion tragedy unfold in real time. For the next 79 days, the president lingered in agony. Infection set in, abscesses formed, the wound festered. Garfield was moved to the Jersey Shore in the hope that ocean air might save him. It didn't. His body wasted away, dropping from 210 pounds to just 130. His mind wandered in fever dreams. He begged for water, ice, anything to cool the burning beneath his skin. "This is a pleasant spot," he murmured during a moment of lucidity, staring out at the Atlantic. "I can see the ocean from here." They were nearly his last coherent words. On September 19, 1881, James A. Garfield died from sepsis and internal hemorrhaging. The bullet hadn't killed him, medicine had. The autopsy revealed that the bullet had become harmlessly encapsulated in tissue, far from any vital organs. In an era of antiseptic surgery already practiced in Europe but not yet embraced in America, Garfield would have almost certainly survived. His assassin, Charles Guiteau, claimed he hadn't killed the president either. "The doctors did," he said at trial. "I merely shot him." It was perhaps the only truthful thing he ever said. During his trial, Guiteau sang, recited poetry, advertised his autobiography, and insulted his own lawyers. He claimed God had commanded the assassination. When sentenced to death, he danced a jig. He was hanged the following year. His last words, a bizarre poem he had written for the occasion. His brain was preserved for study. Scientists hoping to find some physical explanation for such madness. They never did. Garfield's murder exposed the madness of the patronage system, eventually helping spark civil service reform. But it also proved something darker, that even the most ordinary man, driven by delusion and ignored by power, could shape history with a single gun. America would not have long to grieve. Just 20 years later, a new century dawned, and with it, a fresh gunman. One with a bomb in his brain and a handshake hiding a bullet. William McKinley, September 6, 1901. Buffalo, New York. The Pan-American Exposition was in full swing, a celebration of innovation, electricity, and a vision of a bright, humming 20th century. Buildings glowed with Edison's bulbs, flags fluttered. Brass bands blasted patriotic tunes under a sky that didn't seem to know how close it was to blackening. The fair was America's grand statement that it had arrived a technological marvel where the rainbow city of cream-colored buildings stood in stark contrast to the white city of Chicago's World's Fair 8 years earlier. At night, the electric tower blazed with 44 zero lights, a beacon of progress visible for miles. This was the future. Clean, orderly, electrified. A new century, unburdened by the blood-soaked politics of the last. President William McKinley, calm and buttoned up in his usual black frock coat, was there to shake hands. He loved shaking hands. He believed in it, the sacred ritual of democracy. A president, to him, was a man of the people, and if that meant standing in the temple of music and gripping palm after palm until his knuckles turned raw, so be it. McKinley had been warned about security. His secretary, George Cortelyou, had twice removed the public reception from the day's schedule, concerned about the crowds. Twice McKinley had put it back. "Why should I?" he had asked. No one would wish to hurt me. It was the confidence of a man who had survived the Civil War, who had led the nation through the Spanish-American War, who had just secured his second term by a comfortable margin. The bulletproof certainty of a president who believed the American century would be peaceful. The line moved fast. People bowed, smiled, mumbled blessings or requests. McKinley had perfected the McKinley grip, a firm handshake with his right hand, while his left gently touched the person's elbow or shoulder, conveying warmth while keeping the line moving efficiently. 3 seconds per person. A democratic machine of flesh and bone. And then came the man with the bandaged hand. Leon Solgosh, a 28-year-old steelworker, an anarchist, a loner, and a man whose name America would learn far too late, waited patiently in line with a gun wrapped in a handkerchief. He had been living in squalid boarding houses for weeks, nursing his rage and rehearsing his moment in history. The handkerchief wasn't just concealment. It was theatrical, a prop in the drama he had written for himself. In his pocket was a letter explaining his actions, though it would never be read. His eyes were fever-bright, his movements mechanical, as if his body were executing a program his mind had written days before. Solgosh had been radicalized not just by poverty, but by ideology. He idolized Emma Goldman and the anarchists of Europe. He saw presidents not as servants of the people, but as symbols of a system designed to crush the poor. He wasn't insane. He was fanatical, calm, deadly. When his turn came, he moved forward like anyone else. He reached out and fired twice. The first bullet hit McKinley in the chest. The second glanced off a button, lodging in his abdomen. The sound echoed through the temple of music, oddly muffled by the handkerchief, almost like a cough or the pop of a champagne cork. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the crowd couldn't process what they were, seeing the President of the United States, the embodiment of American stability, suddenly folding at the waist, a look of bewilderment rather than pain crossing his face. McKinley staggered backward, stunned but still standing. "Be careful how you tell my wife," he said to his aides. "She will be heartbroken." Even in agony, he was thinking of Ida, his epileptic, fragile wife, who depended on him completely. The woman for whom he had broken protocol throughout his presidency, insisting she sit beside him at state dinners so he could cover her face with a handkerchief if she had a seizure. Security, sluggish and mostly ceremonial, finally acted. A black man named James Parker, standing nearby in line, punched Solgosh in the face and helped wrestle him to the ground. Secret Service agents and soldiers joined in, beating the would-be assassin bloody. "Don't let them hurt him," McKinley gasped, ever the Victorian gentleman, even as his shirt darkened with blood. McKinley was rushed to the exposition hospital, and that's where things began to go terribly wrong. The hospital, designed for minor injurious twisted ankles and fairground mishaps, was woefully unprepared for presidential trauma. The operating table was illuminated only by reflected sunlight, bounced into the room by a metal pan. The surgeon arrived in a blood-spattered suit. He had just finished an operation elsewhere and had no time to change. There was no X-ray machine, no experienced abdominal surgeon, and though the first bullet wound was treated, the second one, the one they couldn't find, was left inside. Doctors stitched him up and hoped for the best. Ironically, an X-ray machine was on display at the fair itself, a marvel of modern medicine. But no one thought to use it on the president. It sat idle while doctors probed blindly in McKinley's abdomen, their fingers introducing gangrene spores that would slowly poison him from the inside. At first, it looked like he might make it. For 8 days, McKinley improved. He ate broth, sat up, spoke kindly to his nurses. Bulletins from the makeshift sick room were optimistic. The stock market, which had plunged on news of the shooting, recovered. Vice President Roosevelt, who had rushed to Buffalo, felt confident enough to return to his vacation in the Adirondacks. Then came the turn. Gangrene, hiding in his stomach tissue, spread rapidly. His organs began to fail. His skin turned gray. His temperature rose, then plummeted. Doctors, realizing too late that they had misread the signs, administered stimulants, oxygen, anything to keep the president's heart beating. On September 14, 1901, William McKinley died. His last words were, "It is God's way. His will be done." The news spread by telegraph, the technology McKinley had championed now carrying word of his death to a stunned nation. Flags dropped to half-mast. The Pan-American Exposition dimmed its electric wonderland in mourning. The Rainbow City went dark. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt, who had been hiking in the Adirondacks, raced to Buffalo and was sworn in amid mourning crowds and fears of an unstable world. He was 42, the youngest president in American history at that time. His ascendancy marked a seismic shift. Where McKinley had been cautious, Roosevelt was bold. Where McKinley spoke softly, Roosevelt carried the big stick. The 20th century would not be McKinley's orderly march of progress, but Roosevelt's rough-riding adventure. As for Solgosh, he stood trial just 9 days after McKinley's death. He refused to speak in his own defense. The jury deliberated for barely half an hour. He was executed by electric chair on October 29, 1901. His final words? "I killed the president because he was the enemy of the good people, the good working people." After his execution, authorities poured sulfuric acid into his coffin, dissolving his body. They wanted no grave, no marker, nothing that could become a pilgrimage site for other anarchists. Leon Solgosh was to be erased from America's memory. But the deed could not be undone. The death of McKinley marked more than just another violent page in the presidential ledger. It ended the age of backslapping, handshaking politics and ushered in a new world, one where the Secret Service previously tasked with fighting counterfeiting now had a new job description: guarding the life of the commander-in-chief. And that's when the presidency, still raw from the sting of murder, landed in the chest of a man who refused to run from bullets even when one was screaming straight for his heart. Theodore Roosevelt. October 14, 1912, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Night had fallen early, crisp and cold, the kind of Midwestern evening that smells like wood smoke and ambition. Theodore Roosevelt stood in the back of an open car, waving to the crowd outside the Gilpatrick Hotel. He was no longer president, had handed that off to his friend-turned-rival, William Howard Taft, but now, disillusioned and roaring with political vengeance, he was running again as a third-party candidate, under a brand-new banner, the Progressive Party. Most people called it the Bull Moose Party, because Roosevelt had once declared, "I'm as strong as a bull moose." He wasn't bluffing. Roosevelt had split the Republican Party like an axe through timber. Conservatives called him a traitor. Progressives called him a savior. The Democratic nominee, Woodrow Wilson, called him the luckiest political opponent in history, splitting the Republican vote, practically guaranteed a Democratic victory. But Roosevelt didn't care. This wasn't about winning anymore. It was about principles, about the soul of American politics. At least, that's what he told himself as he barnstormed across the nation, his voice growing hoarse from speeches in 20 states. The crowd outside the hotel surged with energy. Roosevelt, smiling that carved-into-stone grin, stepped from the car and turned toward the auditorium where he was scheduled to speak. A speech he'd gone over 100 times, folded and tucked into the inside pocket of his coat, 50 pages thick, long enough to bore, bold enough to inspire. His glasses caught the light of street lamps as he moved through the crowd. People reached out to touch him, to feel the electricity of the man who had charged up San Juan Hill, who had gone on African safaris, who had challenged corporations and lived to tell about it. Roosevelt was more than a politician. He was a force of nature disguised as a statesman. He was halfway to the entrance when the gun came out. John shrank, A former saloon keeper from New York emerged from the crowd. Nobody noticed him, not until he raised the .38 revolver and fired a single shot at point-blank range. The bullet slammed into Roosevelt's chest. It was a sound like a book slapping shut, quick, final, unremarkable. The kind of sound that shouldn't change history. But history has a way of pivoting on small sounds. Chaos erupted. Spectators screamed. Bodyguards lunged. Schrank was tackled immediately. But Roosevelt didn't fall. He stumbled, then steadied, looked down at the blood soaking into his shirt, reached into his coat and pulled out the folded speech and his metal eyeglass case, both pierced by the bullet. Both had slowed the slug enough to keep it from tearing into his lungs. The manuscript was a mess, 50 pages of paper, now stained red, a jagged hole through the middle, the words moral issues and corporate power perforated by lead. Roosevelt studied it with academic detachment, as if observing a rare butterfly specimen rather than his own near death. He coughed once. No blood came up. Then he said, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose," and walked into the auditorium. Let that settle for a moment. He had just been shot in the chest, and he still gave the speech. His aides begged him to go to the hospital. His personal physician, Dr. Scurry Terrell, tried to examine the wound right there in the wings of the stage. Roosevelt waved them all off. "You get me to that speech," he growled. "Afterward, I'll go to the hospital." He refused a stretcher, refused assistance. As they hurried toward the auditorium, an aide asked if they should cancel the speech. Roosevelt's response was pure Roosevelt. "I will deliver this speech or die. It's one or the other." He stood at the podium, pale and breathless, and told the audience, "Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." Then he opened his vest, showing the blood-soaked shirt beneath. The crowd gasped. Some women fainted. Men stood stunned, unsure whether to applaud or call for help. "I have a message to deliver," Roosevelt continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "and will deliver it as long as there is life in my body." He talked for nearly 90 minutes. Blood seeped through his shirt the entire time. He didn't just speak, he thundered. He railed against monopolies and corruption. He laid out his vision for a new nationalism, stronger government regulation, protection for workers, conservation of natural resources. He attacked both Taft and Wilson, painting them as puppets of the privileged class. And with each passionate gesture, with each pounding of his fist on the podium, the bloodstain on his shirt grew larger. Those in the first few rows could see him growing paler, his breathing becoming more labored. Yet his voice never faltered. He gripped the podium not just for emphasis, but increasingly for support. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill in the hall, but his words remained sharp, his arguments clear. Eventually, aides convinced him to stop, and he was rushed to the hospital. The doctors found the bullet lodged in his chest muscle, inches from his heart. Too risky to remove, they decided to leave it in. He carried it with him for the rest of his life. "I'm not sick," he wired his worried wife from his hospital bed. "Don't worry about me. I'm as strong as a—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. The world knew how it ended. As for John Schrank, he claimed that the ghost of William McKinley had appeared to him in a dream and told him Roosevelt was a threat to the Republic. Diagnosed as insane, Schrank was committed to a mental institution for the remainder of his life. He died there in 1943. When questioned by police, Schrank was disturbingly lucid about his motivations. He opposed third-term presidents on principle, even though Roosevelt was technically seeking a non-consecutive third term. "Any man looking for a third term ought to be shot," he told investigators. He carried newspaper clippings about Roosevelt in his pockets, along with a poem he'd written titled "The Curse of the Third Term." Roosevelt's response to his would-be assassin was characteristically magnanimous. "The poor creature who shot me has a shattered mind," he said. "I want no vengeance upon him." He even requested that Schrenk not be harmed after the attack. Despite the public sympathy generated by the shooting, Roosevelt lost the election. The Bull Moose had charged valiantly, but ultimately split the Republican vote, allowing Democrat Woodrow Wilson to win with just 42% of the popular vote. Roosevelt came in second, with 27%, ahead of the incumbent Taft. Roosevelt survived the bullet, the election, he lost, and the myth-making. But the spectacle set a precedent that the campaign trail wasn't safe. That political fervor had a pulse, and sometimes it fired. Roosevelt didn't need protection. He was protection. But the world was changing. Fast. Cities were electrifying, ideologies radicalizing. And the next president-elect would learn painfully and publicly that even without the office, the crosshairs never vanish. Especially when your arrival coincides with the rise of the modern American century. Franklin D. Roosevelt, February 15, 1933, Miami, Florida. The Great Depression had America on its knees, banks collapsing like dominoes, soup kitchens stretching down the block, dust storms chewing through farmland, and into this swirling abyss stepped Franklin Delano Roosevelt, legs useless from polio, arms braced on steel calipers, chin high as ever. He hadn't even taken office yet. FDR was still technically president-elect, weeks away from Inauguration Day. But he had the crowd, he had the hope, he had the magic. And he also had a man in the audience with a .32 caliber revolver. Bayfront Park was packed with thousands of Floridians desperate for optimism. They weren't looking for policy, they wanted presence. They wanted to see the man who smiled through braces, who spoke in that silky patrician drawl, who made them feel that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind them. The palm trees swayed in the evening breeze, their shadows dancing across faces lined with worry and hunger. Children sat on parents' shoulders, straining for a glimpse of the man whose voice had crackled through their radio sets during the campaign, promising a New Deal for the American people. The crowd was a tapestry of the struggling factory workers laid off for months, bank clerks who'd watched their institutions fold, farmers who'd fled the creeping dust of the Midwest. They weren't Republicans or Democrats anymore. They were simply desperate. Roosevelt, seated atop the back of his open touring car, had just finished addressing the crowd. He leaned casually against the rail of the vehicle, chatting with Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak. The sky was thick with dusk, the air tense with applause. He had spoken for 20 minutes without notes, his voice carrying across the park with the easy confidence of old money and elite education. This wasn't just charisma, it was alchemy. He transformed fear into hope with nothing but words and that impossible smile. People who had come with slumped shoulders left standing taller, as if Roosevelt's own spine damaged, as it Washad somehow straightened theirs. That's when the first shot rang out. Then another, and another. 5 total. Each crack split the twilight like lightning, too abrupt for thunder. For a second, some thought it was a car backfiring. Then someone screamed. Panic erupted. People screamed, hit the ground. The sound of 100 shoes slapping pavement. Secret Service agents lunged. FDR didn't move. He just turned his head. His expression never changed. No fear registered in those eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Later, witnesses would describe it as the face of a man who had already faced his worst enemy paralysis and found it wanting. What was a bullet to a man who couldn't walk? Giuseppe Zangara stood on a folding metal chair, squeezed between spectators, hand gripped around his pistol. He was barely 5 feet tall, an Italian immigrant with chronic pain and a soul full of rage. His stomach had been tormenting him for years. Some doctors said ulcers. Others said neurosis. Zangara said only one thing made the agony go quiet: the thought of destroying someone powerful. He had arrived at the park 3 hours early, positioning himself just 30 feet from where Roosevelt's car would stop. The metal chair wasn't just for height, it was stability. His stomach pain worsened when he bent over, and standing straight gave him the best chance at a clean shot. He'd practiced drawing the revolver from his pocket 100 times in his rented room, perfecting the motion until it was as smooth as his broken English was rough. He didn't know FDR personally. Didn't even care about politics, really. He just hated the government. All governments. Kings, presidents, the whole system. If power had a face, he wanted to shoot it. Capitalists make me suffer long time, he would later tell police. I want to make capitalists suffer. In his twisted logic, Roosevelt wasn't a person. He was a symbol, a vessel for Zangara's pain to latch onto and destroy. So he fired into the crowd, trying to hit Roosevelt. But the chaos of the moment and his shaky perch on that folding chair sent his aim wild. All 5 bullets missed the president. But they didn't miss everyone else. Mayor Anton Cermak, standing inches from Roosevelt, took a bullet to the lung. 4 others were wounded. One woman, a bystander, caught a round in the stomach. A New York policeman on vacation felt heat graze his scalp as lead parted his hair. A local resident had his wrist shattered. Blood spread across shirts and dresses, turning the tropical evening into a tableau of shock and pain. FDR, calm and eerily composed, turned to the bleeding mayor beside him and said, "I'm afraid, Mr. Mayor, you're hurt." He ordered his driver not to flee, not to rush him away, but to take Cermak to the hospital immediately. Roosevelt cradled the man in his lap as the car sped through the Miami streets. "Don't worry about me," Cermak gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "I'm not afraid to die." "You're going to be all right, Tony," Roosevelt replied, his voice steady, even as Cermak's blood soaked through the president-elect's white suit. "Just lie quiet." For a man whose legs were useless, whose physical strength had been stolen by disease, Roosevelt's arms held the mayor with surprising power all the way to the emergency room. Nurses later said they had to pry his fingers loose from Cermak's hand. Zangara was dragged from the crowd, fists pummeling him from all sides. "Too many people were in the way," he complained as police pulled him to safety from the mob. He was arrested on the spot and quickly confessed, "I have the gun in my hand. I kill kings and presidents first and next, all capitalists." In the interrogation room, Zangara was almost disappointed to learn he had missed Roosevelt. When asked if he was sorry for shooting 5 innocent people, he shrugged. "I sorry I no kill president," he said flatly. His only regret seemed to be that the crowd had been too thick, the chair too wobbly. He pled guilty, expressed no remorse. "I don't like no one," he said. "I shoot the president because I no like the capitalists. No nothing. No nobody." Anton Cermak clung to life for nearly 3 weeks. At first, doctors were hopeful. He seemed stable, but infection set in, complicated by his already frail condition. On March 6, 1933, just days after Roosevelt was sworn in as president, Cermak died. Roosevelt, by then in the White House, ordered flags lowered to half-staff. He sent a telegram to Cermak's daughter that read simply, "I grieve with you in the death of your father, my friend." The official cause of death was peritonitis from the bullet wound. Zangara was charged with murder. And then the wheels of justice turned like a guillotine. Less than 2 weeks after Cermak died, Zangara was tried, convicted, and executed in Florida's electric chair. March 20, 1933. The entire process from gunfire to final breath took just 33 days. There were no lengthy appeals, no psychological evaluations, no debates about his mental state. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Zangara spat out, "You give me electric chair. I no afraid of that chair. You one of capitalists. You is crook man too. Put me in electric chair. I no care." As they strapped him into the chair at Rayford Prison, he seemed almost eager. The guards were unnerved by his calm, by the way he settled into the wooden seat as if it were a throne. His last words? "Push a da button," the executioner obliged. It was the 20th century's first attempt to assassinate a U.S. president using modern media coverage and spectacle. Radio carried the news within minutes. Newspapers ran extra editions before the ink on the verdict was even dry. Newsreels in movie theaters showed footage of Roosevelt's car speeding away from the scene, of Zangara being dragged through the crowd, of the president-elect waving to reassure the nation from his hospital visit. But it also marked the beginning of something even more dangerous, the realization that anyone could get close. There was no steel curtain around the presidency. Not yet. The Secret Service was still mostly reactive, not predictive. There were no motorcade protocols, no armored vehicles, no psychological threat assessments. Roosevelt's personal security detail consisted of just 4 men. They had no training in crowd control, no advanced screening techniques. The president-elect's schedule had been published in the Miami Herald that morning. Anyone who could read a newspaper knew exactly where he would be and when. FDR had been saved not by strategy, but by accident, by the bad aim of a man with ulcers and a folding chair. The failed assassination didn't slow him down. If anything, it sealed the myth. In the weeks after the shooting, as he prepared for inauguration, Roosevelt refused to alter his public appearances. When advisors suggested bulletproof glass for his car, he laughed it off. "If someone wants to shoot me, they'll find a way," he said. "I won't hide behind glass like some museum exhibit." He became president weeks later. He brought in the New Deal. He calmed a panicking nation with his voice over the radio, his confident calm in the fires of economic ruin. And always, just out of frame the bullet that never reached him. Some whispered that the shooting had been a blessing in disguise, that Roosevelt's cool response, his immediate concern for Cermak rather than himself, had demonstrated to the nation the kind of steadiness they needed. In a country desperate for heroism, the president-elect had provided it before even taking the oath. But America wasn't done bleeding, not by a long shot, because the next man in the Oval Office would find himself sleeping in a house filled with ghosts, and he'd wake up one morning to find bullets being traded outside his window. Harry S. Truman, November 1, 1950, Washington, D.C. The White House was under construction, not metaphorically, literally. The century-old mansion had finally started to collapse under the weight of time, termites, and too many inaugural balls. President Harry S. Truman had been moved across the street to the Blair House, a stately but far less fortified government townhouse on Pennsylvania Avenue. For all intents and purposes, it was a hotel with some extra guards outside, which made what happened next even more absurd. Because on that quiet fall afternoon, 2 men from Puerto Rico decided to launch a full frontal assault on the President of the United States, armed, radicalized, and dressed like door-to-door salesmen. Oscar Collazo and Griselio Torresola had flown from New York with one goal in mind: strike a blow for Puerto Rican independence. To them, Truman wasn't just a man, he was the symbol of American colonialism. Puerto Rico had been a U.S. territory since 1898, but to these 2 nationalists, it was occupied land. And occupation demanded resistance, violent, public, and unforgettable. These weren't lone wolves. They were members of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, a group led by the fiery Pedro Albizu Campos. Just days earlier, nationalists had launched coordinated uprisings across Puerto Rico itself, taking over police stations and government buildings in what would be known as the Jayuya Uprising. It was a revolution in the making, and the assassination attempt was meant to be its crowning moment, its international headline. Blair House had light security, a couple of Secret Service agents on guard rotation, no fences, no bulletproof glass, and no expectation that 2 guys with pistols would storm the front steps in broad daylight. The attack began just before 2 p.m. Torresola approached from the west side. He was the better marksman, had spent the night before teaching Collazo how to use a gun. He crept up on Private Leslie Caufelt, a White House police officer stationed in a guard booth near the building. Torresola fired 4 times. Caufelt collapsed. Then Torresola walked up and shot him again at close range, a headshot, execution style. At the same time, Collazo ran up the east side steps and tried to draw his gun, fumbled with it, and was immediately shot in the chest by a Secret Service agent. He didn't die, but the shot dropped him to the sidewalk. The gunfight erupted into chaos. Secret Service agent Floyd Boring returned fire. So did officers Joseph Davidson and Donald Birdsell, despite Birdsell being hit in the knee. Blood spattered across the pristine steps of Blair House as pedestrians scattered for cover. Pennsylvania Avenue, one of America's most iconic streets, transformed into a war zone in seconds. Torresola, hearing the commotion, sprinted to help. Another shootout erupted. Bullets flew across Pennsylvania Avenue. Tourists screamed. Nearby workers dove for cover. And then, in a moment that would become legend, Private Caufelt, the officer who had been shot 4 times and hit in the head, pulled himself upright with his last ounce of life. He aimed his revolver and fired once. The bullet struck Torresola in the head. He died instantly. Caufelt collapsed and died 4 hours later. Inside Blair House, Truman had been napping. The shot startled him awake. He walked to the window, peeked through the curtain, and saw Collazo sprawled on the steps. A Secret Service agent yelled for him to get down. He did. Later, with characteristic Truman bluntness, he would tell reporters, "A president has to expect these things," as if assassination attempts were simply part of the job description, like ribbon cuttings and cabinet meetings. The attack lasted just 40 seconds. Torresola dead, Collazo wounded and arrested, 1 officer killed, 3 others injured. Truman unharmed, but not untouched. The aftermath revealed how deeply unprepared American security had been. Investigations showed that Collazo and Torresola had simply walked up to Blair House carrying German P-38 and Luger pistols with more than 30 rounds of ammunition. No metal detectors, no perimeter sweeps. The most powerful man in the free world, protected by little more than a wooden door and a few men with revolvers. In the aftermath, reporters asked him if he would reconsider his support for Puerto Rican autonomy. His answer was defiant. "No. The only thing you can do with Puerto Ricans," he said, "is treat them like Americans." Collazo stood trial for murder. He was sentenced to death. But in 1952, Truman, the very man he had tried to kill, commuted his sentence to life in prison. Decades later, President Jimmy Carter would commute it again. Collazo was released in 1979 after serving 29 years. He returned to Puerto Rico, was received as a folk hero by some, and died in 1994. As for the presidency, this attack forced a total rethink of executive security. No more temporary lodging, no more exposed porches, no more sleepy guards with paperbacks in the booth. The modern Secret Service was reborn. From that moment on, the president would live in a fortress, because even in the heart of the Capitol, in the most carefully curated corner of American power, the guns could still find their way inside. Blair House itself was retrofitted with bulletproof windows and reinforced doors. Presidential motorcades were redesigned. Security perimeters expanded. The idea of the accessible president, the citizen executive, who could walk among the people, died that day on Pennsylvania Avenue, and a little more than a decade later, one of those guns wouldn't miss. One shot, one kill, and the world would never be the same. John F. Kennedy, November 22, 1963. Dallas, Texas. The sun rose without hesitation that morning, spilling gold over the rooftops of a city holding its breath. It was a Friday, the end of a long week, a long year, a long Cold War hangover that never seemed to lift. The president was coming to town, and Dallas, like the rest of the country, was split right down the center between worship and hatred. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, 35th President of the United States, war hero, Irish Catholic, photogenic titan, was riding high in public charisma and low in private security. He refused to hide behind barriers. No bubble top over the Lincoln Continental, no bulletproof glass. He wanted the people to see him, smile, connect. It was politics as theater, and JFK was the star. He was midway through a campaign swing across Texas, trying to mend the Democratic Party's internal fractures ahead of the 1964 election. Dallas was the flashpoint. The city had a reputation. Conservative, volatile, electric, with political tension. Just a month earlier, UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson had been spat on and hit with a placard while visiting the city. But Kennedy wasn't worried. "We're going into nut country," he told an aide, "but Jackie and I are going to give it our best." And so they did. The presidential motorcade departed Love Field just after 11. 45 a.m., Kennedy in the back seat, Jackie by his side in her now iconic pink Chanel suit. Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie sat ahead of them. The car was open. The crowd was huge. Cheers rolled like thunder down Main Street. Hand-painted signs. Women weeping. Children on shoulders. The kind of reception that made you forget, even for a moment, that death has a schedule. At 12:30 p.m., the car turned onto Elm Street and rolled into Dealey Plaza. The book depository loomed at the corner like a forgotten relic. 6th floor, far window. A man waited. Lee Harvey Oswald, a drifter, a former Marine, a Marxist who had defected to the Soviet Union and come crawling back. He was 24, quiet, wound tight, a sniper in search of history. He had brought a cheap Italian bolt-action rifle with a scope, a Carcano Model 91, 38 wrapped in a blanket and stored it in the building days earlier. He had told co-workers it was curtain rods. As Kennedy's limo passed the grassy knoll, Oswald took aim. First shot missed, or maybe hit the curb, confusion. Second shot struck Kennedy in the upper back, exiting through his throat. Connally turned, was hit next. A bullet cracking through his back, chest, wrist, and thigh. Then, the third shot. It hit Kennedy in the head. A burst of blood and bone. A spray that painted the trunk of the limousine. Jackie climbed onto the back, not fleeing, reaching. For what? For a piece of his skull. For time. For anything that made sense. The car accelerated. Secret Service agent Clint Hill climbed aboard. Too late. Too late for everything. At Parkland Hospital, the trauma team tried in vain. They performed a tracheotomy over the throat wound, not realizing it was an exit. But it didn't matter. John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead at 1:00 p.m. The country unraveled in real time. News anchors wept on air. Schools dismissed early. Phones stopped ringing. The myth of American invincibility cracked wide open and bled out across black and white television screens. Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in aboard Air Force One at 2:39 p.m., Jackie standing beside him in her blood-stained suit, refusing to change. "I want them to see what they've done," she said. Meanwhile, Oswald fled the book depository, took a bus, then a cab, then wandered the streets like a ghost. At 1:15 p.m., he encountered Officer J.D. Tippit shot him 4 times and kept walking. He ducked into the Texas Theater without buying a ticket. The cops found him 30 minutes later. He resisted. They dragged him out screaming, "I am not resisting arrest," and "I am a patsy." The world watched the story spiral, then twist again. 2 days later, as Oswald was being transferred from the city jail, a man stepped out of the crowd and shot him in the stomach. Live on national television. His name was Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner, connected to organized crime, obsessed with Kennedy. His motives were a storm of grief, delusion, and ego. Oswald died at 7 p.m. in the same hospital where Kennedy had been declared dead. And just like that, the prime suspect was gone. The conspiracy theories were born. The Warren Commission would conclude that Oswald acted alone. But the damage was done not just to the president, but to the public's faith in reality. The Zapruder film, captured by a civilian on a home movie camera, would become the most analyzed 26 seconds in American history. Frame by frame, back and to the left, back and to the left. Kennedy's assassination was more than a murder, it was a rupture. The moment where the 20th century took off its mask, where innocence was executed in an open car at high noon. Camelot, the fantasy White House dream that JFK's presidency was sold as, died with him. And in its place, a new rule emerged, unspoken but ironclad. The presidency is never safe. Because if a bullet can reach you in a crowd of thousands, on camera, in broad daylight, with the world watching, then no amount of power can save you. And as America grieved as the drums beat slow for a fallen king, the next president would find himself carrying that coffin's shadow all the way to California, where another young man with a gun and a grudge was already loading the next chamber. Richard Nixon. By the time Richard Nixon took office in 1969, the White House was less a home and more a bunker. The ghosts of Dallas still roamed its halls, whispering reminders that no amount of popularity or paranoiacal guarantees survival. Nixon heard those whispers louder than most. He didn't need a bullet to make him sweat. He had enemies, lists of them, walls covered in names, grudges cataloged like a librarian of vengeance. But what Nixon didn't know, what even his most loyal agents couldn't predict, was that somewhere out in the ether, in diners and cheap apartments and hotel rooms filled with cigarette smoke and rage, were two men with very different reasons to want him dead. 2 attempts, 2 years apart. Both failed, but each one was a different kind of madness. The first was quiet. April 13, 1972, Ottawa, Canada. Nixon was in town for a diplomatic visit, the kind where handshakes are rehearsed and speeches come pre-packaged with polite applause. Among the crowd lining the route of his motorcade was a young man named Arthur Bremer. Bremer was the kind of person history forgets until he forces his way in. Awkward, lonely, disillusioned with everything. He tried to leave a mark as a political activist but found no one listening. So he decided on something louder. At first, he stalked Nixon. He showed up in Ottawa armed with a revolver, planning to shoot the president as his motorcade passed. He even got close enough to spot Nixon through the car's tinted windows. But Fatih's poor timing intervened. The motorcade moved too fast. Bremer didn't get a clean shot. And then, just like that, Nixon was gone. But Bremer wasn't. He shifted his focus, and a month later, he walked up to Democratic candidate George Wallace at a campaign rally in Maryland and shot him 5 times, leaving Wallace paralyzed for the rest of his life. Bremer was arrested on the spot. In his diary published later as An Assassin's Diary, confessed that his motive was fame, not politics. "I did it to be noticed," he wrote. "I did it to put my name in the history books." And so he did, just not the way he wanted. But Nixon's close call didn't end there, because the second attempt didn't come from the sidewalk. It came from the sky. February 22, 1974, Baltimore Washington International Airport. Samuel Bick was not an assassin in the traditional sense. He wasn't looking to shoot Nixon from a rooftop or plant a bomb under a podium. His plan was more theatrical, more suicidal, more insane. Bick was a failed businessman and Vietnam veteran with a growing list of grievances. He blamed the government for everything: poverty, inflation, inequality, and he believed Nixon was the puppet master behind it all. So he came up with a plan. He would hijack a commercial airliner. He would force the pilots to fly it directly into the White House. And he would kill the president in the first ever suicide plane attack on American soil. Bick left behind cassette tapes explaining everything. He mailed them to journalists and public figures. He believed he was starting a revolution. On the morning of February 22, he walked into the airport wearing a stolen United States Army uniform and carrying a revolver and a gasoline bomb in a briefcase. He stormed Delta Flight 523, which was just minutes from takeoff. He shot and killed an airport security guard, then burst into the cockpit shouting orders. The pilots refused. One was killed, the other wounded. Bick was wounded in the shootout that followed. Surrounded by police, bleeding and delirious, he shot himself in the head. The plane never left the tarmac. But the message did. Security at airports changed overnight. The threat wasn't just on the ground anymore. It was airborne. And the presidency? It had entered a new chapter where the threats weren't just gunmen in the crowd. They were everywhere. In the skies, in notebooks, in the heads of men who believed history owed them something. Nixon would go on to resign in disgrace, undone not by an assassin but by a tape recorder. But his brushes with death were a reminder. The presidency may survive scandal, but it can never outrun obsession. And the next man to sit in that chair would learn the lesson twice at the barrel of two different guns, in the span of 17 days, both wielded by women who didn't miss because of incompetence, but because of fate. Gerald Ford. By 1975, the presidency had become less a symbol of authority and more a pressure cooker with a national address. Gerald Ford, thrust into the Oval Office after Nixon's resignation, was walking a tightrope strung over the burning wreckage of Watergate, Vietnam, and a public trust in freefall. He was the only president never elected to the presidency or vice presidency, a man appointed by crisis, not chosen by ballot. A placeholder, some said. A band-aid on a bullet wound. But that didn't stop the bullets from coming. In fact, it brought them closer. Because in the span of just 17 days, two very different women in two very different cities pulled out two very real gun sand, aimed them at the 38th President of the United States. The first attempt was silent, chilling, and very, very close. September 5, 1975. Sacramento, California. Ford was walking from his hotel to the California state capitol, surrounded by a modest crowd and an even more modest security detail. He was all handshakes and bland smiles, waving politely as he moved through the sunlit park. Among the crowd stood a woman with long red hair, pale skin, and the unmistakable gaze of someone who wasn't really there. Her name was Lynette Squeaky Fromm. She was a disciple of Charles Manson. Yes, that Charles Manson. While Manson was serving a life sentence for murder, Fromm had stayed on the outside, orbiting the prison system like a broken moon. She dressed in red, believed in Manson's prophecies, and had convinced herself that Ford was poisoning the planet through environmental neglect. That morning, she walked up to the president with a Colt .45 hidden in a leg holster beneath her long dress. She raised it point blank at his stomach and pulled the trigger. Click. No shot. The gun wasn't chambered. She hadn't racked the slide. Whether it was oversight, incompetence, or divine error, it saved the president's life. Secret Service agents tackled her to the ground. She didn't resist. She smiled. It didn't go off, she told them. Can you believe it? Fromme would later say she didn't intend to kill Ford, just scare him. The jury didn't buy it. She was sentenced to life in prison. Ford, shaken but composed, continued on to the Capitol. He gave his speech as planned, but his nerves were fraying. The unspoken reality was setting in. Even with security, even in broad daylight, even with cameras rolling, death could be a breath away. And then came the second attempt. Just 17 days later, September 22, 1975, San Francisco, California. Ford was exiting the St. Francis Hotel after a luncheon. The crowd was denser than Sacramento, the air thicker, the fear now a low hum in every agent's earpiece. Among the onlookers was a woman named Sarah Jane Moore. She was 45, middle class, well-educated, former nursing student, former FBI informant. A strange resume for an assassin. But Moore had radicalized quickly. One day she was feeding information to the government. The next, she was feeding herself fantasies about revolutionary change through blood. She carried a .38 caliber revolver, purchased just days before. At 27 feet away from the president, she raised the weapon and fired. The bullet missed Ford's head by just 6 inches. Chaos exploded. Secret Service agents shoved the president into his limousine. Bystanders screamed. But before Moore could fire a second shot, a bystander named Oliver Sipple, former Marine, Vietnam veteran, lunged and grabbed her arm. The second bullet flew wild, striking a building. Moore was wrestled to the ground, arrested, and later sentenced to life in prison. Ford survived. Again. By inches. Twice. The press couldn't decide whether to marvel at his luck or mock his magnetism for chaos. Johnny Carson joked that Ford's security should just start throwing women into the path of danger as a preemptive strike. But the truth was sobering. 2 women, 2 attempts, 17 days. Neither was part of a conspiracy. Neither had a political manifesto that made sense. They weren't foreign agents. They weren't militia members. They were homegrown, wandering through the maze of American radicalism like ghosts with guns. And Ford? He kept smiling, kept walking. But his presidency was forever shadowed by the knowledge that he had dodged death not by design, but by chance. He once said, "I'm a Ford, not a Lincoln." And in those 2 near deaths, it became clear just how thin that line was between surviving the presidency and being remembered with a marble bust and a date carved into stone. Because the next man to step into the White House would face a world of sniper rifles, exploding buildings, and the slow birth of an American security state that no longer hoped for luck, it depended on it. Ronald Reagan. March 30, 1981, Washington, D.C. It had been just 69 days since Ronald Wilson Reagan took the oath of office, one hand on a family Bible, the other raised to a sky that didn't yet know how quickly the air would turn electric. He was the oldest man ever elected president at that time, an actor turned governor turned leader of the free world. The Cold War still cast its long shadow, and Reagan, charismatic, flinty, wrapped in cowboy ease, walked into it like a man ready to rewrite the script. But history had other plans, violent ones. And by 2:27 p.m., on that spring Monday, the presidency would once again find itself in the crosshairs of obsession, delusion, and the kind of moment that rewrites every Secret Service manual in real time. The day started routinely. Reagan was scheduled to speak at the Washington Hilton Hotel to a gathering of AFL-CIO union leaders. The Hilton was a familiar location. Nicknamed the Hinckley Hilton in grim hindsight, the hotel had a secure driveway. Designers had promised safety. They didn't factor in madness. Reagan arrived at the hotel at 1:45 p.m., flanked by his usual detail and senior aides. Among them, James Brady, his press secretary, Tim McCarthy, a Secret Service agent, and Thomas Delahanty, a D.C. police officer. They moved in a practice dance, Reagan smiling and waving to the press corps, gliding inside for his speech. What no one knew, not yet, was that 25-year-old John Hinckley Jr. was standing outside, patient, unblinking, wrapped in gray and carrying a Rome RG-14.22 caliber revolver in his coat pocket. Hinckley had been stalking Reagan for weeks. He'd followed him to campaign stops, scribbled in his journals, studied his schedule. But Reagan wasn't the real target, not at first. The real prize was Jodie Foster. Yes, that Jodie Foster. Hinckley had seen her in Taxi Driver. The movie. The role. The fixation. She played a 12-year-old prostitute saved by Robert De Niro's Travis Bickly, a character who, in the film's climax, attempts to assassinate a presidential candidate. For Hinckley, the lines between fiction and reality disintegrated. He began writing letters to Foster while she was a student at Yale. She ignored them. So Hinckley decided to do what Bickle did. He'd kill a president. And in doing so, he believed he would win her love. He waited outside the Hilton as Reagan's speech wrapped up. At 2:27 p.m., the president emerged through a side door flanked by a cordon of security. That's when Hinckley stepped forward, raised the revolver, and fired 6 shots in 1.7 seconds. The sound was a muted clap, then another, then a scatter of them, like popcorn in a sealed jar. Chaos exploded. Agent Tim McCarthy did the unthinkably, spread his arms and took a bullet to the abdomen, shielding the president with his body. Officer Delahanty was hit in the neck. James Brady, Reagan's press secretary, was struck in the head. He dropped like a marionette with cut strings. And the 6th bullet? It ricocheted off the limousine's bulletproof panel, curved back at an impossible angle and hit Reagan in the chest. Nobody realized he'd been shot. Not even Reagan. He was shoved into the car by Agent Jerry Parr, gasping, pale. "I think you broke my rib," Reagan said with a grimace. Then, "I can't breathe." That's when Parr saw the blood. The bullet had punctured Reagan's left lung, missing his heart by less than an inch. Parr made a decision on that likely saved the president's life. He diverted the motorcade from the White House and ordered the car to George Washington University Hospital. Reagan walked into the ER under his own power before collapsing. Inside, doctors moved fast. They found internal bleeding, oxygen levels plummeting. Emergency surgery began. As Reagan was wheeled in, he looked up at his surgeons and cracked a joke. "Please tell me you're all Republicans," he said. One of the doctors replied, "Today, Mr. President, we're all Republicans." The bullet was removed. The bleeding stopped. Reagan survived. Just barely. Outside the OR, the nation spun in shock. The image of a president being shot was still raw from Dallas, still embedded in the American brain like a trauma that never fully scabbed over. But this time, the ending would be different. Reagan recovered, fast, publicly, heroically. Within weeks, he was back on television, back in the Oval Office, cracking jokes about ducking next time. James Brady didn't recover. The bullet to his brain left him paralyzed for the rest of his life. He and his wife, Sarah, became tireless advocates for gun control. Their work led to the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, passed in 1993. Hinckley? He was found not guilty by reason of insanity. The verdict sparked national outrage. For decades, he remained in a psychiatric hospital, penning songs, painting, occasionally writing bizarre love letters. In 2016, he was released under strict conditions. And in 2022, yes, 2022, he launched a YouTube channel to share his music. Let that timeline sit with you. A man tried to kill the president to impress a movie star, and 40 years later, he's singing folk songs online. But what the Reagan assassination attempt truly revealed wasn't just the madness of individual sit exposed the fragility of the world's most protected man. 6 shots, 1 near miss, a country on edge. After that day, everything changed. Security was restructured, Secret Service agents were retrained, emergency response drills rewritten, the bulletproof bubble tightened. And yet, the pattern remained. Because presidents don't just inherit power, they inherit a target. And in the years to come, that target would move again, sometimes halfway across the world, sometimes just to the back lawn of the White House. Because death, in the world of the presidency, doesn't need an invitation. Just a crack in the armor. And the next man in line would find that even the walls of 1,600 Pennsylvania Avenue couldn't keep the guns at bay. Bill Clinton. October 29, 1994. Washington, D.C. The leaves were turning in D.C., bright orange and red banners of seasonal change lining Pennsylvania Avenue. It was a calm Saturday afternoon. Tourists milled about outside the White House gates, taking photos, joking, peering through the black iron fence like it was a zoo exhibit instead of a high-security perimeter surrounding the most powerful office in the world. Inside the White House, President Bill Clinton was going about his day, no major public appearances scheduled, just the standard mix of briefings, calls, and quiet reflection. It was a breath between battles. Politically, the air was thick with midterm anxiety. Republicans were gaining momentum with their contract with America. But the president had weathered worse. Arkansas had taught him how to smile through a storm. He had no idea that, on the other side of that gate, a man was locking a rifle into place. Francisco Martin Duran wasn't a name anyone knew. Not yet. He was a former Army private, dishonorably discharged after a conviction for assault. Aimless, adrift, and increasingly paranoid, Duran had spiraled into a world of conspiracy theories and personal demons. He believed the government was being controlled by aliens, or lizard people, or something worse. His thoughts were erratic, but his resolve was focused. He packed his car with weapons and ammunition and drove from Colorado to Washington, D.C., convinced he was about to wage a one-man war against the corruption he imagined inside the White House walls. Just before 3:00 p.m., he pulled his 1,974 Chevrolet Suburban onto Pennsylvania Avenue, parked near the front gate, and stepped out carrying a Chinese-made SKS semi-automatic rifle. He walked straight up to the north fence of the White House and opened fire. A burst of 29 rounds cracked through the air like a string of firecrackers. Glass shattered, concrete splintered. The iron bars of the fence clanged with the impact of lead. Tourists screamed and scattered. Secret Service agents sprinted toward the sound. One tackled Duran from behind, knocking him to the ground before he could reload. Inside the White House, the West Wing went into lockdown. For a brief moment, agents believed the attack might be a diversion, a prelude to something bigger. Snipers scrambled to their posts. Communications went dark. President Clinton was inside the residence, unharmed, unaware at first of just how close death had come. Miraculously, none of the bullets had made it through the White House's armored windows. No one was injured, but the message was unmistakable. The fortress wasn't impenetrable. Duran was taken into custody. During interrogation, he unleashed a torrent of bizarre, contradictory statements. He ranted about an alien conspiracy, about how the Clintons were puppets for a shadow government. At trial, his attorneys argued insanity, but the jury didn't buy it. In 1995, he was convicted of attempted murder of the President of the United States and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Duran later claimed he didn't mean to kill Clinton, that he was just sending a message. But when you fire 29 rounds into the seat of American power, the semantics of intention fall apart. For Clinton, the incident was a jarring reminder that the presidency is not just a job, it's a target. And while he continued to project calm and confidence, the Secret Service redrew its playbook. Security around the White House perimeter was tightened. More surveillance, more armed guards, more invisible fences surrounding the visible ones. But the real takeaway was psychological. Duran wasn't part of a militia. He wasn't a foreign agent. He wasn't even particularly coherent. He was a lone man with rage and a rifle. And that was enough. Enough to turn the front lawn of the White House into a war zone for 20 seconds. Enough to make future presidents think twice about strolling out for a photo op. Enough to remind the nation that madness doesn't need an army. Just a magazine and a moment. And as the Clinton years rolled into the new millennium, as Monica and impeachment and scandal came and went, the quiet threat of violence never left the room. Because the next president would inherit not just the world's spotlight, but its crosshairs. And on the far side of the globe, in a country teetering between democracy and danger, a hand would reach back, pull the pin, and try to rewrite American history with a grenade. George W. Bush. May 10, 2005, Tbilisi, Georgia. It was supposed to be a symbol of friendship, a moment to show the world that the Cold War's ghost could be exorcised and that America's reach was no longer feared but welcomed. President George W. Bush had traveled to Tbilisi, capital of the Republic of Georgia, to stand beside its president, Mikhail Saakashvili, and reaffirm their alliance. A gesture, a handshake, democracy on parade. The crowd was massive. Tens of thousands filled Freedom Square, packed shoulder to shoulder beneath the towering statue of St. George, slaying a dragon, an image thick with irony. Giant American and Georgian flags whipped in the wind. Children sat on shoulders. Old men clutched newspapers. A military band played to the rhythm of history. The stage was set, and the target was already in place. Vladimir Arutyunian stood near the front of the crowd, just a few dozen feet from the stage. He was 27, poor and invisible, the kind of man who slips through security because he looks like everyone else, because there's nothing special about his face, because the rage he carried was packed small, neat, and deadly. In his pocket, Arutyunian carried a Soviet-made RGD-5 hand grenade, modified and armed. The safety pin had been removed. Instead, he'd wrapped a red handkerchief tightly around it, holding the safety lever, the spoon, in place. It was an improvised time bomb disguised as a patriotic flourish. As President Bush stood at the podium, delivering warm praise for Georgia's democratic reforms, Arutyunian reached into his pocket. He tossed the grenade. It flew through the air, landed in the crowd, and didn't explode. Security didn't even notice at first. The grenade had landed just 61 feet from the president. It was nestled among the legs of concertgoers, trampled beneath confusion and noise. The red handkerchief had prevented the spoon from releasing, stopping the detonation. It was a miracle of fabric, a twist of fate that kept the square from turning into a bloodbath. The Secret Service only discovered the grenade hours later. It was real, it was live, and it was deadly. Once again, a president of the United States had stood in the blast radius of intent and walked away untouched. But the danger wasn't over. The FBI, Secret Service, and Georgian police launched a full-scale manhunt. They released security footage, searched homes, interviewed suspects. Days turned into weeks. Then, in July, acting on a tip, Georgian authorities stormed a house in a Tbilisi suburb. Inside was Arutyunian. He didn't go quietly. A gunfight erupted. One Georgian agent was killed. Arutyunian was wounded, arrested, and brought into custody. Under interrogation, he confessed everything. He had acted alone. He hated America. He hated the Georgian government. He had attended the rally with the full intention of killing both presidents. He had no manifesto, no organization, just fury and a grenade. Arutyunian was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. His trial was swift. The evidence, the grenade, the footage, his confession was undeniable. But in a chilling postscript, authorities discovered something even darker. When they raided his home, they found a chemical lab, homemade explosives, maps, instructions, a personal archive of rage. It wasn't just a one-off. He had been preparing for war, and he got within 20 yards of the President of the United States. The public didn't absorb it fully at the time. The event barely made headlines in the US. The grenade didn't explode. No one was hurt. Bush's speech finished without a hiccup. But behind the scenes, alarms rang. Security protocols were reevaluated, crowd control methods rewritten. The Secret Service began factoring in not just snipers and shooters, but lone men with pockets full of fire. Bush, known for his swagger and casual defiance of danger, didn't dwell on it. He never spoke much about the attempt, but those who stood beside him that day knew how close they had come to rewriting history. Because the thing about assassination attempts isn't that they always fail. It's that they almost don't. One pin, one less knot in a handkerchief, one slip, and a flash in the crowd turns into silence on stage. As Bush's presidency ground forward through wars, Katrina, recessioned the image of Freedom Square remained, burned into the minds of his security team. And the lesson stuck. No matter where you go, no matter how loud the applause, no matter how far from home you stand, there's always someone watching from the crowd, waiting to make their move. And in the years to come, that someone wouldn't even need to leave the country, because the White House was about to face a shot from within its own borders, glass shattered, bullets fired, and a first family too close to danger to pretend it wasn't real. Barack Obama, November 11, 2011. Washington, D.C. It was a quiet Friday night on the south lawn of the White House. The leaves had begun to fall in sheets, carpeting the grounds in amber and rust. From a distance, the most powerful address in the world looked almost peaceful, lights glowing in the windows. Secret Service agents pacing in patterns known only to them, tourists snapping pictures through the bars. Inside, President Barack Obama was not home. He was away on an official trip, thousands of miles removed from the familiar white facade and the daily routines of executive life. But absence did not mean safety. And this time, it would be the absence itself, the empty house, that revealed just how vulnerable the presidency had become. Oscar Ramiro Ortega Hernandez was 21 years old, angry and unraveling. He had grown up in Idaho, bounced between jobs, struggled with mental illness. But by the fall of 2011, he had spiraled fully into delusion. He told people that he believed Obama was the Antichrist, that he was the devil, that it was his mission to stop him. He drove from Idaho to Washington, D.C. in a black Honda Accord. With him, a Romanian-made Cougar SA semi-automatic rifle, modified to mimic an AK-47. In his mind, he was a revolutionary, a prophet, a man on a divine mission. In reality, he was a lone, armed drifter with a trigger finger and an apocalyptic fantasy. On the evening of November 11, Ortega Hernandez parked his car along Constitution Avenue near the ellipse just south of the White House. He stepped out, raised the rifle, and fired. 7 to 9 shots cracked through the dark. Glass shattered. Windows broke on the second floor of the White House residence, specifically the first family's private living quarters. One bullet hit a window but was stopped by ballistic glass. Another struck the exterior wall. Several more tore through the trees and fencing, lodging in brick and plaster. Then, he fled. At first, Secret Service agents weren't sure what had happened. Some thought the sounds were backfiring cars. The alert was raised, but confusion reigned. It took 4 days for anyone to realize that the White House had actually been hit by bullets. 4 days. A White House housekeeper noticed broken glass. That's when the true horror of the situation finally dawned. A man had fired an assault rifle at the president's residence and got away. The implications were massive. This wasn't some faraway rally or obscure campaign stop. This was the center of American power, supposedly impenetrable, and it had been breached without anyone even noticing. Once the realization sank in, the manhunt intensified. Security footage, forensic analysis, interviews with bystanders. Eventually, the pieces pointed to Ortega Hernandez. His car was discovered in a ditch near the George Washington Parkway, the rifle still inside. Fingerprints matched, surveillance footage placed him in the area. A nationwide manhunt kicked into high gear. He was arrested a week later in Pennsylvania, staying at a friend's house. During interrogation, Ortega Hernandez was calm. He believed he had done the right thing, that God had chosen him, that Obama wasn't a man, but a monster. He showed no remorse. Federal prosecutors charged him with attempting to assassinate the President of the United States, among other crimes. At trial, his defense argued mental illness. Psychiatrists diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. The prosecution didn't dispute it, but they pushed for accountability. In 2014, Ortega Hernandez was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The aftermath inside the Secret Service was explosive. How could it take 4 days to realize bullets had struck the White House? Where was the response? The detection? The awareness? An internal review began. Agents were disciplined. Protocols rewritten. For an agency priding itself on protecting the presidency, it was a moment of public failure, and it shook confidence to its core. But the bigger story, the darker one, was how thin the line had become between safety and catastrophe. Obama wasn't home. Michelle, Sasha, Malia, none of them were home. That's what saved them. Had the president been standing in front of that window, even just for a moment, history could have turned. A rifle, a fantasy, a few seconds of aim, and the second black president in American history might have been the second sitting president to die by assassination. The event, though briefly covered in media cycles, vanished from most public consciousness. No one died. The president was away. Another almost in the long history of what-ifs. But behind closed doors, it changed the way security thought, the way America thought. Because this wasn't a foreign assassin. This wasn't a sniper on a roof halfway across the world. This was a young man from Idaho who drove across the country, parked his car, and fired into the home of the president with the belief that he was on a holy mission. And as the years marched forward, as social media multiplied, as conspiracy theory metastasized, the next man to take office would find himself not just in the middle of the storm, but the eye of it. And the gunmen wouldn't be hiding anymore. They'd be out in the open. And they'd have more than delusion, they'd have motive, momentum, and an internet cheering them on. Donald Trump, June 18, 2016, Las Vegas, Nevada. It was hot, brutally hot. The kind of desert heat that makes the air shimmer and your thoughts scatter. But inside the Treasure Island Hotel and Casino, it was even hotter, not from temperature, but tension. Donald J. Trump was speaking. The 2016 election was still months away, but Trump had already broken the political machine. He wasn't just running, he was winning. With a red tie, unfiltered speeches, and a campaign that felt more like a WWE promo than a platform, he had turned arenas into battlefields and debates into demolition derbies. And standing in the crowd that day, quiet and pale, was a 19-year-old British citizen named Michael Stephen Sanford. He didn't look like an assassin. He looked like a background extra from The Office. Thin, nervous, quiet. But he wasn't there to listen. He was there to kill. For months, Sanford had been planning. He had flown from the UK to the US with one mission in his head: assassinate Donald Trump. Not for fame, not for ideology, but because he believed it was the only way to save the world from collapse. He suffered from severe mental illness, obsessive-compulsive disorder, anorexia, and paranoid delusions. He believed if Trump became president, it would trigger global destruction. And he believed he was the only one who could stop it. He didn't bring a gun. Instead, he decided to take one from a police officer. During Trump's speech, Sanford approached a Las Vegas Metropolitan Police officer and asked for an autograph. Then, suddenly, he lunged for the officer's holstered sidearm. He managed to get his hand on the grip, almost pulled it free. Almost. The officer wrestled him to the ground. Sanford was arrested immediately. He later told investigators he had driven from California to Nevada specifically for the event, that he had visited a shooting range days before to practice, that he had planned to keep trying if he failed. Trump never knew how close it had come. The attempt never made it past the arena floor, but the reality was bone-chilling. Here was a kid with no criminal record, no network, no training, just a mental health crisis, a belief in apocalyptic fantasy, and the proximity of a loaded gun. Sanford pled guilty to being an illegal alien in possession of a firearm and disrupting an official function. He was sentenced to 12 months in prison and later deported to the UK after serving most of it. And that might have been the end of Trump's assassination saga. Except it wasn't. Because 8 years later, in 2024, the bullets didn't just threaten, they landed. On July 13, 2024, at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, Donald Trump was standing at the podium, mid-speech, mid-rhetoric, when shots exploded across the field. The crowd dove, screamed, the Secret Service jumped. Trump was hit. The bullet entered near his right ear and exited through his cheek. Blood sprayed. A supporter standing nearby was killed instantly. Others were wounded. The shooter, Thomas Matthew Crooks, a 20-year-old Pennsylvania resident with no criminal history, no known affiliations, and no clear motive beyond a storm of online radicalization and disillusionment. Crooks fired from a rooftop more than 100 yards away, a sniper's perch. He was quickly killed by return fire from Secret Service snipers. Trump survived. Barely. He was rushed off stage, hand clamped to his bleeding face, and airlifted to safety. Photos of the moment blood-soaked face, fist raised defiantly, went instantly viral. Within hours, the world knew. Donald Trump had been shot and lived. The shock wasn't just national, it was planetary. It was the first time since Reagan that a presidential candidate had been shot on the trail and survived. The incident reignited every debate about security, extremism, and the thin line between political passion and violent action. It also triggered a wave of conspiracy theories, misinformation, and partisan firestorms all before the crime scene tape had even cooled. And just 2 months later, it nearly happened again. September 15, 2024. Trump International Golf Club, Florida. Secret Service agents spotted a suspicious individual near the perimeter. The man later identified as Ryan Wesley Routh was armed. When confronted, he opened fire. A shootout ensued. Routh was wounded and taken into custody. A search of his vehicle revealed more weapons, ammo, and cryptic writings about stopping the tyrant and resetting the cycle. 3 attempts. 1 successful shot. 1 dead supporter. 1 wounded candidate. No other American president or major party nominee in modern history has ever come under that much fire. But Trump had now joined an elite, macabre club, presidents who've taken a bullet and lived to tell the story. And with that, the long, blood-flecked narrative of assassination attempts reached its final act for now. Because what began with a flintlock misfire in 1835 had become a saga of snipers, planes, handguns, grenades, and unfiltered delusion. From Jackson to Trump, from duels to drones, the story has always been the same. Power draws fire. And the presidency of the United States? It might just be the most bullet-attracting job on earth.